There's a photograph buried in a Massachusetts estate archive. 3 generations of men standing rigid as monuments, their eyes fixed on something just beyond the camera's edge. The date stamped on the back reads 1947. By the time this image was taken, 12 members of this family had already died by their own hand. But that's not what makes this photograph unbearable to look at. It's the way the youngest boy is gripping his father's coat. Like he already knows, like the weight of what's coming has already settled into his bones before he's old enough to name it. This is the Wardwell family. And for over a century, they've been dying the same death over and over again, in a cycle so precise it began to feel less like tragedy and more like ritual, depression, mania, psychosis, suicide. The pattern repeats with the regularity of a heartbeat, passed down through blood and memory, through silence and shame, through the unspoken understanding that some families don't just carry names, they carry curses written into their very cells. You won't find their story in textbooks. There's no museum exhibit, no documentary series, no national conversation, because America doesn't like to talk about the things that happen behind closed doors in respectable families. The kind of families with land, with legacy, with portraits lining the halls of homes that have stood since before the Revolution. We prefer our tragedies loud and distant. We like them tied to war or poverty or something we can point to and say, that's the reason. But the Wardwells had wealth, they had education, they had everything a family could want, except the one thing they needed most, an escape from themselves. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's not myth wrapped in New England fog. This is documented, medical records, death certificates, letters that should have been burned, journals left behind by people who knew they were running out of time. This is the story of a bloodline that built itself on Puritan discipline and American ambition, only to discover that what they were really building was a tomb. And the question that haunts every generation isn't why did this happen? It's why does it keep happening? Why can't we stop it? And most terrifying of all, who's next? The Wardwell line begins in 1692, in the shadow of the Salem witch trials. Samuel Wardwell, no relation to the accused Samuel Wardwell who was hanged that year, moved his family inland, away from the hysteria, away from the accusations, away from the madness that had consumed the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He built a farm, he built a reputation, he built a family that would endure for centuries, and in doing so, he laid the foundation for something he could never have understood, because Samuel Wardwell carried something in his blood that wouldn't show itself for generations. A genetic time bomb that would tick quietly through the decades, waiting for the right combination of inheritance to detonate. By the 1840s, the Wardwells were no longer farmers. They were industrialists, lawyers, physicians. They married into Boston's elite. They sent their sons to Harvard and their daughters to finishing schools in Europe. They collected art, built libraries, donated to churches. On paper, they were the American dream made flesh. But in the private letters exchanged between family members, a different picture emerges. Mentions of cousin Edward, who locked himself in his study for weeks at a time, emerging gaunt and hollow-eyed, speaking in riddles about doors that wouldn't close. References to Aunt Margaret, whose nervous condition required her permanent removal to an institution in Vermont, where she died at 31, her cause of death listed simply as exhaustion. Whispers about Uncle Thomas, found in the carriage house with a rope around his neck and a Bible open to Job. The family called it melancholia. They called it weak constitution. They called it anything except what it was, an inherited disorder passing silently from parent to child, expressing itself in different intensities, different symptoms, but always there, coiled in the DNA like a serpent waiting to strike. And because this was the 19th century, because this was a family of standing and reputation, because mental illness was seen as a moral failing rather than a medical condition, the Wardwells did what so many families did. They hid it, they institutionalized the worst cases quietly, they rewrote death certificates, they burned letters, they created a mythology of strength and resilience that had no room for the truth, that they were sick, that they had always been sick, and that every child born into this family was playing genetic roulette with a loaded gun. The turning point comes in 1923 with the birth of Jonathan Wardwell III. His father was a prominent surgeon in Boston. His mother came from old Connecticut money. By all accounts, Jonathan was a brilliant child, reading at 3, fluent in Latin by 7, accepted to Harvard at 16. But brilliance and madness have always shared a border so thin you can't see it until you've already crossed. At 19, during his sophomore year, Jonathan experienced what his roommate would later describe as a complete collapse of self. He stopped sleeping, he stopped eating, he covered the walls of his dormitory room with mathematical equations that made no sense, geometric patterns that spiraled into themselves, phrases in languages he'd never studied. He told his professors he'd discovered the true structure of time. He told his family he could hear his ancestors speaking through the walls. And then, on a February morning in 1942, he walked into the Charles River and didn't come back out. His suicide note was 3 pages long, written in immaculate handwriting, and it contained a single, coherent sentence buried among the chaos. I have traced the sickness back to the beginning, and there is no beginning, only inheritance. The family had him buried quietly. They told friends it was a drowning accident. They donated a wing to the university in his name. And they said nothing about the fact that Jonathan had spent his final months obsessively researching family genealogy, constructing a chart that mapped every death, every institutionalization, every whispered case of madness going back 5 generations. He'd marked certain branches in red ink, the branches where it concentrated, where it expressed most violently, and his own name sat at the end of one of those red lines like a death sentence he'd always known was coming. But here's what Jonathan discovered that the family tried to bury along with him. The pattern wasn't random. It followed genetic laws that wouldn't be fully understood for another 50 years. The disorder, what we now recognize as bipolar disorder with psychotic features, was passing through the Wardwell line with brutal efficiency, amplified by generations of intermarriage among Boston's elite families who all carried similar genetic vulnerabilities. They'd been concentrating the illness without knowing it, creating a genetic bottleneck that ensured nearly every child born after 1900 would carry some version of the trait. Some would be spared. Some would experience mild depression or manageable mood swings. But others would inherit the full weight of centuries of accumulated genetic damage, and for them there would be no escape, only the question of when it would manifest and how badly. By the 1960s, the Wardwell family had fractured. Some branches moved west, changed their names, tried to outrun what they carried in their blood. Others stayed in Massachusetts, clinging to tradition, to the estate, to the belief that willpower and proper breeding could overcome biology. But the deaths continued. Richard Wardwell, 1955, gunshot wound to the head in his study. Catherine Wardwell, 1963, overdose of barbiturates, ruled accidental, but the empty bottle told a different story. Michael Wardwell, 1971, jumped from the Tobin Bridge on a Tuesday morning in October, leaving behind a wife and 2 children who would grow up knowing their father chose the water over them, And then there were the ones who didn't die but wished they had. Elena Wardwell spent 40 years cycling through psychiatric institutions, her moments of lucidity growing shorter and further apart until there was nothing left but a woman who no longer recognized her own children. David Wardwell became so paranoid he stopped leaving his house, convinced the government was monitoring his thoughts, that his food was poisoned, that his own reflection was an impostor. He died alone in 1989, surrounded by walls covered in aluminum foil and newspapers dating back decades. The coroner said natural causes, the family said nothing at all, but the most disturbing case is Sarah Wardwell. Born in 1958, she was the first member of the family to seek treatment voluntarily, the first to stand up in front of doctors and say the words that had been forbidden for generations. "There is something wrong with us. It runs in our family. I need help." She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at 23. She took her medication religiously. She went to therapy. She did everything right. And for 15 years, she lived a relatively stable life. She married. She had a daughter. She believed she'd broken the curse through modern medicine and sheer determination. But in 1996, during a particularly severe manic episode, something shifted. She became convinced that the medication was what was killing the family, that doctors were part of a conspiracy to eliminate the Wardwell bloodline, that the only way to save her daughter was to stop all treatment immediately. Within 6 weeks, she was dead, and the note she left behind, the one her daughter still has, locked in a safety deposit box she's never opened, reportedly contains a list of names. Every Wardwell who died by suicide, going back to the 1840s. 37 names, and at the bottom, in her mother's handwriting, a single question: how many more before we admit what we are? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have children, knowing what you might pass on? Would you take the test to see if you carry the genes? Or would you choose not to know and live with the uncertainty hanging over you like a shadow that grows longer every year? Because that's the choice facing the Wardwells who are alive today. In 2003, genetic testing became available that could identify markers for bipolar disorder and related conditions with reasonable accuracy. For the first time in 300 years, family members could know, really know, whether they carried the genetic variants that had destroyed so many lives. Some took the test immediately. Others refused, saying they'd rather live in ignorance than carry the weight of certainty. And a few took the test, received positive results, and simply vanished from family contact, unable to bear the knowledge of what they might become or what they might pass to children not yet born. The current generation is small. Decades of death and voluntary childlessness have reduced the family to less than 20 known living members. Most are estranged from one another. They don't gather for holidays. They don't share updates on social media. They exist in isolation, connected only by blood and the terrible knowledge that somewhere in their cells a clock is ticking. Some have been diagnosed and are managing their conditions with medication and therapy. Some show no symptoms and pray they never will, and some are watching themselves deteriorate in real time, recognizing the signs their parents showed, their grandparents showed, knowing exactly where this road leads and feeling powerless to change direction. There's a woman, we'll call her Jennifer, though that's not her real name, who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. She's 34. Her mother was a Wardwell who died when Jennifer was 9. She's tested positive for the genetic markers. She's been in treatment since her early 20s, and she made the decision never to have children. "People don't understand," she said. "They think it's about me being scared or selfish. But I've seen what this does. I've read the letters. I've visited the graves. I know exactly what I'm carrying, And I know exactly what it feels like when it starts to wake up inside you. It's not just depression. It's not just mood swings. It's like there's another person inside you, and they're stronger than you are, and they want you dead. And knowing that I could pass that to a child, that I could create another person who would one day stand where I'm standing and feel what I'm feeling, I can't do it. The family line ends with me, and I'm okay with that. But here's what makes the Wardwell story more than just a medical tragedy. It's what the family knew, and when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. Because by the 1950s, there were doctors in the family. There were researchers who understood genetics, at least in the rudimentary way it was understood then. They knew something was being passed down. They knew the pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. And yet they said nothing. They continued to encourage marriages within their social class, which meant marriages between families who all carried similar genetic loads. They continued to have children, sometimes many children, without warning them what they might be inheriting. They treated each new case of mental illness as an isolated incident, a personal failing, bad luck, anything except the systematic genetic catastrophe it actually was. There are letters from the 1960s, discovered in an estate sale, where family members discuss the problem in coded language. They refer to it as the family temperament, or the Wardwell Constitution. One letter, written by a physician uncle to his nephew who was considering marriage, contains this chilling passage. You must understand that certain traits run strong in our blood: sensitivity, intensity, a mind that burns perhaps too bright. These are not flaws, but the price of greatness. Many of our finest minds have struggled, yes, but they have also achieved remarkable things. Do not fear what you carry, master it. This advice was given to a young man who would be dead by his own hand within 7 years, leaving behind a journal documenting his descent into psychosis with clinical precision, as if he were observing his own destruction from outside his body. The family's silence wasn't ignorance, it was choice, a deliberate decision to prioritize reputation and lineage over the welfare of future generations. They believed, or convinced themselves they believed, that strength of character could overcome biology. That proper upbringing, education, and social standing could protect their children from the genetic hand they'd been dealt. And when that failed, when another cousin or sibling or child succumbed, they simply absorbed the loss, held the funeral, and moved forward as if tragedy were as inevitable as the changing seasons. They built a culture around endurance, around suffering in silence, around the idea that to acknowledge the pattern was to give it power. So they said nothing. They warned no one. And the deaths continued, generation after generation, each one preventable, each one a direct result of the family's refusal to speak the truth out loud, that they were sick, that they had always been sick, and that love alone could not save them from what lived in their blood. The Wardwell estate still stands in Massachusetts. It's been converted into a private residence, owned now by someone with no connection to the family. The portraits are gone. The library has been emptied. The rooms where people died have been repainted, renovated, stripped of history. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces. Initials carved into windowsills. Names etched into the foundation stones. A family cemetery at the edge of the property where 37 graves sit in neat rows, their dates of death clustering in ways that stop being coincidence after the first dozen. The current owner says the house is fine, no strange sounds, no cold spots, no ghosts, because the haunting was never supernatural. It was genetic, it was biological, it was the kind of curse that doesn't need spirits or demons because human DNA is terrifying enough on its own. The Wardwell story isn't unique. Across America, there are families carrying similar burdens, similar secrets, similar patterns of death that repeat with mechanical precision. Mental illness runs in families. Addiction runs in families. Suicide runs in families. We know this now. We have the science. We have the medications. We have the therapeutic interventions. And yet we still struggle to talk about it openly, to warn the people we love about what they might be carrying, to make the hard choices about whether to have children when we know what we might pass on. We still treat these conditions as personal failures rather than medical realities. We still hide the deaths, rewrite the stories, protect the family name at the expense of the family itself. There are currently 6 known living Wardwells under the age of 40. 3 have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. 1 is in treatment for severe depression. 1 shows no symptoms but refuses genetic testing. And 1, the youngest, barely 20, is just beginning to show the signs. The mood swings, the sleepless nights, the intensity that everyone calls passion until it tips over into something darker. She knows the family history now. Previous generations hid it from their children, but the current generation made a different choice. They told her everything, showed her the letters, took her to the graves, gave her the knowledge that might save her life, or might simply allow her to watch her own destruction with open eyes. She's in therapy. She's on medication. She's doing everything right. But late at night, she reports, she sometimes thinks about that photograph from 1947. The 3 generations of men, the boy gripping his father's coat. And she wonders if knowledge is enough, if medicine is enough, if anything is enough to break a pattern that's been running for 300 years. The Wardwell family built their legacy on tradition, on the belief that blood and name and lineage mattered above all else. And they were right. Blood matters. It matters more than they ever imagined, because blood doesn't just carry your name forward. It carries everything, the gift and the curse, the genius and the madness, the love and the violence. And sometimes the only way to save the ones you love is to let the bloodline end, to be the last one, to close the book on a story that should have ended generations ago. That's not tragedy. That's mercy, and maybe, in the end, that's the only tradition worth keeping.